ASP.NET Core has support for the dependency injection design pattern, and in this video we'll show you how to implement it into ASP.NET Core. Now, dependency injection is when you inject an instance of an object into another object that it relies on. In ASP.NET Core, there are 3 service lifetimes that are relied on in dependency injection. We'll show you what they are, how they work, and how to implement them. We'll also show you some of the common errors that you might get when using dependency injection in ASP.NET Core and how to resolve them. Now, for more ASP.NET Core coding tutorials, visit roundthecode.com, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/roundthecode, and follow us on Twitter. It's at roundthecode. Join the Round the Code Discord server. Ask your ASP.NET Core question and get our community to help solve your issue. Go to roundthecode.com/discord. Before we start implementing dependency injection, let's have an overview of how it works and the different service lifetimes. So we have a singleton lifetime. Any objects that are registered using the singleton lifetime will be initialized until the application stops. Then we have the scoped lifetime. In the case of an ASP.NET Core application, a scope is initialized when a HTTP request is made and is disposed of when a HTTP response has been returned. However, it is possible to explicitly define when a scope begins and when a scope ends. Finally, we have the transient lifetime. We have taken the example of injecting a service registered with the transient lifetime into a controller, then injecting the same service into a view. Regardless of where a service with a transient lifetime is injected, it will create a new instance every time it's injected. So in order to test dependency injection, we're going to set up an ASP.NET Core web application and implement it within that. Now, I've got Visual Studio 2019 open in front of me, so let's go ahead and create a new project. Let's select ASP.NET Core web application, and let's give it a name of roundthecode.di, which stands for dependency injection. Let's select ASP.NET Core web app, model view controller, and press create. This will now set up our project for us. Okay, so our project is set up. What I want to do now is I want to right click on the solution. We can go to properties. So now I'm going to go down to debug. I'm going to select project. I'm going to untick launch browser and select the app URL to be localhost 4000 and save it. Okay, so let's give that a run and see if it's actually going to work for us. Okay, so our application is now working. Let's just see if it's going to work for us. So let's open up Chrome, localhost 4000:4000. That's where we're running our ASP.NET Core application. Let's just see if it's going to run. As you can see, our application is running, so we can go ahead now and implement dependency injection. So now we're going to get dependency injection to work in ASP.NET Core. And if you remember at the beginning of the video, I showed you 3 different service lifetimes that are available with dependency injection in ASP.NET Core. What we're going to do is we're going to set up a service for each of those service lifetimes. So we've got the project open in front of us. So let's go ahead and create a new folder and let's call it services. So we're going to start off with a new interface. I'm going to call it singleton service. Okay, we need to make it public. What we're going to do is we're going to set a property in here of time, and I will show you how that works in a bit. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a new class. We're going to call that singleton service. We're going to inherit the singleton service, so the interface that we just created. We're going to bring in the time property and make that public. Okay, so we're now going to create a new constructor And the whole point here is we're going to set the time property to the current time. That way we can actually test for when the actual instance is initialized, and we can test out the different lifetime services that are available. So go ahead and create the constructor, and let's set the time now, and we're going to format it in hours, minutes, seconds, and we're going to do the seconds up to 6 decimal places as well. So we've done that for the singleton. We now need to do it for the scoped and the transient as well. So we're going to set up separate services for those lifetime services. So let's go ahead and we'll copy them. I'll rename this to iScoped service. Rename that. We're going to do the same with this one as well. For the singleton service, we're going to create one for scoped service. Inherit the iScoped service and bring in the constructor. Rename the file as well. And finally, we're going to do it for the transient service as well. So let's go ahead and do exactly the same thing. Okay, so let's do the same thing again. So let's rename this to iTransient service. And finally, we are going to rename this to transient service as well. Like so. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to register these services in dependency injection, and importantly we also need to specify which service lifetime we're going to actually use. So in order to do that, we go into the startup class. We've got our configure services in there. So the way we can do it, we call our services iService collection instance, and for singleton we call the add singleton method, and we pass in not just the class but the actual interface as well. Let's pass in the interface and the class. So the singleton service is being registered as a singleton in dependency injection. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the scoped. So once again, we're going to specify the interface and the class. Finally, we're going to do the same for the transient. So now we've created our classes, we've registered them in dependency injection, we need to go ahead and test them. Now how are we going to do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new controller and do it that way. So we're going to add a new controller, we're going to create an empty one, and we're going to call it DI controller. We're going to set a root up here. And so every time a method is called within this DI controller, it will go through /DI, and that is represented by this root attribute up here. We're going to use the index, but before that we basically need to bring in our interfaces, our dependencies, our actual services into the controller. Now in order to do that, what we do is we call the constructor, and with dependency injection we can actually bring in the instances from dependency injection as a parameter in the constructor. So we'll bring in the iSingleton service, call it singleton service, but do the same for scoped as well. I'll bring that down there for you so you can see, and we'll do the same for the transient service. Now what we want to do up here is we want to create local variables which sit within the DI controller. So these instances that we're bringing in from dependency injection, they're going to be available as local variables within the DI controller. So once again, we're going to make them public, passing the type of iSingleton service, and we'll call it underscore singleton service. We'll do the same as well for the scope service. Append a underscore next to it, and let's do the same for transient service. So now in the constructor, we're going to bring in our local variables and set them for the variables that have been declared when we pass them in as a parameter as part of dependency injection. Got our singleton, got our scope service, and we've got our transient service. So what we're going to do now is create a model, and we will return this model to the view. The model is going to specify the time property for each of these services that we've created in dependency injection. So we're going to go ahead and create a new class within the models folder, and we're going to call it DI model. And in here we're going to set up 3 public strings: singleton time, scoped time, and the transient time. Now that we've done that, we'll go back to our controller. We're going to use the index method. So in here we're going to create a new instance of the DI model. Bring in the assembly for it. And now we're going to set each string property to the actual time in each of our services that we set up. So for the singleton time, we're going to call our singleton service instance. I'm going to set the property of time to it. And we're going to do exactly the same for scoped. And exactly the same thing for transient. And we're going to return that as a view, and we're going to pass in our model instance into that view. I'm going to get rid of the default one down there. Okay, so if we were to run this now, it won't work because we haven't set up the view. So what we need to do is we need to go into our views folder. We're going to create a new folder. We're going to call it DI. Next, we're going to go ahead and set up a new view. We're going to create a new empty razor view. We're going to call it index.cshtml. We're going to pass in our model of DI model. And we're just basically going to output those values. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the values to see how they are represented. So we've got our singleton one. So we're going to specify controller singleton and pass in the singleton time from the model. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for scoped. Pass in scope time, and exactly the same thing for transient. Okay, that's all set up now. So we're going to now go ahead and run our application, and we're going to load up this controller, this actual page, to see what values we get brought back. Okay, so our application is now running. Let's give it a refresh. Give it a load up. So on there we've got our values of the singleton, the scoped and the transient. Let's go ahead and give it a refresh. So as you can see, the singleton, the value has stayed the same. That is because with a singleton service lifetime, an instance is only created when the application is started, and it will remain there until the application stops. But as you can see with the scoped and the transient, the values actually change. So a scoped works with a HTTP request and is disposed of when it is responded. So the values for the different requests are different, and transient always creates a new instance. So we injected the services into the controller. What I want to do now though is inject those same services into the view to see if we're actually getting the same values back for that time property. So what we're going to do now is we're going to modify the index view. We're going to pass in our assembly for where our dependency injection services are hosted. What we're going to do now is with a Razor view, you can use the inject keyword to inject services into the Razor view. So we're going to call that. I'm going to call the iSingleton service and name it as a value of singleton service. And we're going to do the same thing for scoped service. And lastly, we're going to do the same for transient. Now what we're going to do is we're going to output the actual time value into the view from these actual injected services to see what the difference is. I'm going to do it for each of the service lifetimes. Do the same for scoped. And finally do the same for transient. Okay, so let's start up our application and see the different values and see what they give to us. Okay, so our application is running, so let's load up the page and see what happens. So as you can see with the singleton, it doesn't matter whether we inject it into a controller or into a view, the value is exactly the same. And you can see that it's the same story with scoped as well, because with scoped, the controller and the view is still part of the same HTTP request, so the values are going to be the same. But it is a different story with transient, as you can see. The controller transient has an earlier time than the view transient as well. And that, as I say, is because it's initialized every time it's injected. So now I want to show you another way of implementing dependency injection into ASP.NET Core. So what we've done is we've implemented each service individually, but what we can do is we can also bring in an actual collection of it and then specify each service that we require for the particular usage. So I'm back in my controller now, and what I can do here is I can go ahead and I can get rid of these parameters, which is going to cause an error, but we're going to sort that out. And what I can do is I can pass in the iService provider instance, and this will store all the services that have been registered as part of dependency injection. Now we can go ahead and set the local variables for these. So what we can do is we can call service provider dot get required service, which we need to bring in. Bring that in. And what we do is we pass in the actual interface as the generic method. We pass in iSingleton service. And we can do the same thing for scoped as well. And finally for transient. Now with this application, we haven't got too many services that this controller relies on. But if you've got a lot more services that it does, this is a lot more simple way. You don't have to pass each service in the constructor as a parameter. If you've got, say, more than 10, there's going to be a lot of parameters that are going to be required for the controller and it can get quite confusing. So we can go ahead and do exactly the same thing in the view as well. So we can inject the iService provider. And then from there, we can specify our local services as part of the view. I'm going to declare the singleton service. And before we do that, we need to pass in our assembly. So we need Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection. Then we can call the get required service from the service provider instance and pass in our service as the generic type. Do the same thing for scoped service. And finally for transient. Okay, so we've made that change. Let's run our application and just make sure it works. Okay, so our application is running. Let's load up the page again and let's just make sure it works. So as you can see, it's all working using the iService provider. So now I want to look at some of the common errors you might face when using dependency injection in ASP.NET Core. So what I've done here is I've opened up the singleton service, and what you can do is very similar with what we did with the controller, is we can actually pass in dependency injection services that have been registered, and we can pass them into the constructor like we did with the controller. So with the singleton service, I'm going to pass in the iTransient service. But what I'm going to do now as well is I'm going to go into the transient service and pass in the iSingleton service. Now I'm going to go ahead and run the application to see what happens. So as you can see, we've got an error, and the error reads, a circular dependency was detected for the service of type iSingleton service. So if we come out of this, so if we go back into our singleton service, you can see we're passing in the instance of the iTransient service. But if we go back to the transient service, we're passing in the iSingleton service. So the thing's just basically going round and round, and that's not allowed in ASP.NET Core. Now the next thing we need to have a look at as well is if we go into our singleton service, let's pass in the iScope service. Let's go ahead now and run that and see what happens. Okay, so we're getting an error, and the error reads, cannot consume scope service round the code, DI services iScoped from singleton iSingleton service. So when the singleton service is looking for the scope service, it doesn't know which scope to use, so it throws that error. Now if you want to use a scope service in a singleton service, the best way of doing that is explicitly actually creating the scope, which we'll have a look at in a bit. And the final error I want to show you is if we go into startup class. So if we go ahead first and we remove that instance. Now if you're starting up in dependency injection, it's hard to get your head around it at first, and you might do a common thing like you might forget to actually register the service. So we'll show you what error you get if you do that. So if we remove the transient one, and let's see what happens. So let's run our application again. Let's try and load the page. And as you can see here, it's got an error saying no service for type iTransient service has been registered. So that's a common error you'll get if you forget to actually register the service as part of dependency injection. So now I want to go ahead and explicitly define a scope in ASP.NET Core. Now the best way of doing this is through a hosted service. Now a hosted service is basically a background service, and within that we're not actually having the scope defined for us, so we need to go ahead and define the scope for us. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into services, I'm going to create a new item, I'm going to call it DI hosted service. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the I hosted service interface, and I need to bring in the reference. So that's done. And I'm also going to bring in the methods as well that we require. Now, before I do anything into this, what I need to do is I need to go into Startup, go into the Configure Services method, call our instance of iService collection, and what I need to do is I need to call the Add Hosted Service method, passing in our DI hosted service. Okay, so back to our DI hosted service. We don't need to stop async, so what I'm going to do that is just going to return a task.completed task. Now with the DI hosted service, I need to call in the constructor and I need to pass in a parameter. So let's call the constructor. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the iService provider instance. And like what we did with the controller, we're going to pass in a local variable for it. So we're going to set that up here, make it public. What we're going to do is we're going to set that variable to the parameter that we're passing in. So now that we've got our instance of iService provider available to our hosted model or hosted service, we can go ahead and use it to create a new scope. So we go in here, we declare the scope, and we're going to use the service provider .create scope, which we need to bring in the reference. Gone ahead and brought in Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection. Let's now go ahead and created our scope. What we can do now is we can bring in our services from dependency injection that is required for this scope. So in order to do that, we declare local variables for them, and we can use scope.serviceprovider.getRequiredService, and we pass in our interface as the type. We can do the same as well for scoped. And it's exactly the same for a transient service. Now in order to test this, it's a background task. So what we're going to do is we're going to write each time property to the debug. So we can go ahead, call debug, we need to bring in the reference in for that, which we've done. I'm going to call the write line method, I'm going to use the string.format, singleton time 0, and then we're going to pass the time in, the time property as a parameter. It's exactly the same thing for the scoped. And do the same thing for the transient. Now, doing it this way means that we can have more than one scope. We don't have to be limited to just that one scope. So we can go ahead and do that. If we go in, so there we go, we've got two scopes in here. So the singleton service and the transient service will work in exactly the same way as it does before. So the singleton service lasts for the lifetime of the application, and the transient service always creates a new instance regardless. Now with the scope service, it creates a new instance for here, and it remains to the end of the scope, which will be there. And for this scope service, it begins when this is actually declared, and then it ends when the scope's finished. Let's go ahead now, run our application, and see if we can see those lines written to our debug. Now before we do that though, we need to just go ahead and return a task.completed task because we were getting a compile error. Let's go ahead now and run that, our application. So we've got our debug open here, and as you can see, it's outputting from our hosted service the singleton time, the scope time, and the transient time. Now something to take note on this is the scope time there is .995 on the end, whereas with our new scope, it's .006 on the end. So you can see it's a new instance of the scope for each scope that we actually define. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you how to use a delegate when registering a service in dependency injection. Now you might want to use a delegate to explicitly define the instance of the service. This is particular if you're not using dependency injection for one of the parameters, just say you're passing in a string or an integer. So in order to do that, we can still use the add singleton method, but there's another extension here. And we've got this delegate here. It requires an instance of iServiceProvider passed in, and it needs to return a singleton service. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We'll name the instance service provider. And now we can go in here and create our method. So in here, we'd just return a new instance of the singleton service, just like that. So this is absolutely fine. So if we wanted to create a new parameter and it's not part of dependency injection, we can do it this way, and that's the way we can do it explicitly. So that's how you use dependency injection in ASP.NET Core. However, if you used dependency injection in .NET Framework before, you might be familiar with AutoFac. AutoFac is another package for using dependency injection. But whereas with ASP.NET Core's dependency injection, it's quite simple, with AutoFac, it's a bit more detailed, such as being able to choose between 7 different lifetimes. However, my personal opinion is that ASP.NET Core's dependency injection is more than sufficient to do the job. Now thanks very much for watching, and remember to hit a like on the video.